Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In 1973, San Francisco was about to face one of its darkest chapters, a 179-day reign of terror that would become known as the Zebra Murders. What began with the brutal attack of a couple near Telegraph Hill would spiral into a series of calculated killings that paralyzed the city with fear. Young, well-dressed men were hunting random white victims across the city, leaving a trail of bodies and baffled investigators in their wake. The truth behind these murders would reveal something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined: an organized death squad with a terrifying mission. Let's dive into the chilling story of the Zebra Murders and the shadow they cast over the city by the bay. In the autumn of 1973, San Francisco was about to face one of its darkest periods, a series of brutal, racially motivated killings that would become known as the Zebra Murders. The wave of terror began on October 20th, 1973, when Richard Haig and his wife Quita were walking near their Telegraph Hill home. What started as an ordinary evening would become the first in a string of horrific attacks that would paralyze the city with fear for the next 179 days. That night, 3 men forced the Haigs into a white van. They drove the couple to a remote industrial area near Potrero Hill. There, in an act of unimaginable brutality, the attackers hacked at Quita's face with a machete, nearly decapitating her. Richard was also attacked, his face slashed repeatedly, but somehow survived after being left for dead. He would later become a crucial witness, though his trauma-clouded memories would prove frustratingly incomplete. Just 4 days later, Frances Rose, a 28-year-old physical therapist, was sitting in her car near the University of California Extension Center. A man approached her vehicle, asked for directions, then suddenly pulled out a gun and shot her repeatedly in the face. The killing was swift, senseless, and showed no signs of robbery as a motive. The violence escalated rapidly. On November 9th, a 26-year-old art student named Paul Dansick was tied up near a bus stop at Geary and Divisadero streets. Like Frances Rose, he was shot multiple times at point-blank range. The pattern was becoming clear. These weren't robberies gone wrong or crimes of passion. They were executions. The San Francisco Police Department was baffled. The victims seemed random, yet there were disturbing similarities in the attacks. The killers were described as well-dressed black men, usually operating in groups of 2 or 3. They showed no interest in robbery, and their violence was excessive, often involving multiple gunshots or brutal machete attacks. As winter approached, the frequency of attacks increased. On December 11th, Arthur Agnos, who would later become mayor of San Francisco, was walking near Potrero Hill after attending a community meeting. 2 men approached him and, without warning, shot him 4 times in the chest. Agnos survived, but the attack demonstrated that no one was safe, not even prominent community leaders. The police investigation was hampered by a lack of solid leads and the seemingly random nature of the victim selection. The only common thread was that all the victims were white, leading investigators to suspect a racially motivated campaign of terror. But the why and who remained frustratingly elusive. The killers struck again on December 13th, gunning down Marietta DiGirolamo as she walked near her apartment in the Haight district. Then, on December 20th, they killed Ilario Bertuccio, shooting him while he was closing his small grocery store in the Bayview district. These murders showed the killers were growing bolder, attacking in different neighborhoods, and showing no pattern that police could use to predict their next move. The city was gripped by fear. The attacks seemed to happen anywhere, at any time. People began avoiding walking alone, especially after dark. Local businesses suffered as customers stayed home. The racial tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of San Francisco's progressive facade began to boil over. the investigation took a significant turn when police discovered a connection to a small group within the Nation of Islam. The suspects were allegedly part of a splinter group that operated out of a mosque on Fillmore Street. However, proving these connections would prove challenging, as the organization maintained a code of silence and the few witnesses were reluctant to come forward. The name Zebra came from the police radio channel used for the investigation, Channel Z. The case was so massive that it required its own dedicated frequency. The name stuck, though it would later take on additional meaning as a grim reference to the racial nature of the crimes. Black assailants targeting white victims. As 1973 drew to a close, the city braced itself for what would come next. The killers showed no signs of stopping, and the police seemed no closer to catching them. The new year would bring even more violence, as the zebra killers continued their reign of terror with increasing brutality and frequency. The attacks particularly terrorized the city because of their unpredictability and apparent lack of motive beyond racial hatred. Unlike other serial killers who might target specific types of victims or operate in certain areas, the zebra killers struck throughout San Francisco, choosing victims seemingly at random. Their only consistent criteria appeared to be that their targets were white. The investigation was further complicated by the social and political climate of the time. The early 1970s were marked by significant racial tensions across America, and San Francisco was no exception. Law enforcement had to walk a delicate line between pursuing the killers and avoiding accusations of racial profiling that could further inflame an already tense situation. By the end of 1973, the official death toll stood at 6, with several more victims wounded but surviving their attacks. However, investigators suspected the true number might be higher, as similar attacks had occurred in other parts of the Bay Area that couldn't be definitively linked to the zebra killers. The police response was massive but frustrated. Traditional investigative techniques seemed ineffective against these killers, who left few clues and had no apparent connection to their victims. The randomness of the attacks made it impossible to establish a geographic pattern or predict where they might strike next. The killers' methodology was evolving too. While some attacks were quick shootings, others showed signs of ritual and torture. The level of violence suggested that the killers were becoming more confident and possibly more organized in their approaches to murder. As 1974 began, the city would face an even more intense phase of the killing spree. The zebra murderers would become bolder, their attacks more frequent, and the city's response would grow increasingly desperate. The next phase of the investigation would lead to controversial tactics and raise questions about civil rights versus public safety that would echo for decades to come. The fear that gripped San Francisco was unlike anything the city had experienced before. Residents who prided themselves on their city's reputation for tolerance and progressive values were forced to confront the reality that a racially motivated killing spree was unfolding in their midst. The zebra murders would not only challenge the city's self-image, but would also test the limits of its law enforcement capabilities and its commitment to civil rights in the face of unprecedented terror. As 1974 dawned, the zebra killers showed no signs of slowing their campaign of terror. On January 28th, 5 men committed one of their most horrific attacks yet. They kidnapped Jane Holly, a 45-year-old woman, at a laundromat on Haight Street. In a shocking display of brutality, they forced her to kneel in prayer position before shooting her in the back of the head. The killing was witnessed by several people, but the perpetrators seemed unconcerned about leaving witnesses. The same night, Roxanne McMillian was shot and permanently paralyzed while carrying groceries to her car. The attackers' confidence had grown to the point where they were now striking multiple times in a single evening, spreading terror across different neighborhoods of the city. The pattern of violence continued to escalate. On April 1st, 19-year-old Thomas Rainwater was shot and killed near Ghirardelli Square, one of the city's most popular tourist destinations. The killers were now striking in broad daylight in crowded areas, demonstrating a complete disregard for the massive police presence that had been deployed throughout the city. The San Francisco Police Department, under intense pressure to stop the killings, took the unprecedented step of implementing what would become known as Operation Zebra. In a controversial move, they began stopping and questioning any black men who matched the general description of the suspects, which was frustratingly vague. Young black males, usually well-dressed, between 20 and 30 years old. This led to the stopping and searching of hundreds of innocent men, creating significant tension between law enforcement and the African American community. Mayor Joseph Alioto defended the stop-and-search policy, arguing that extraordinary measures were necessary given the extraordinary circumstances. However, the NAACP and other civil rights organizations quickly filed suit, arguing that the policy amounted to racial profiling and violated constitutional rights. The tension between public safety and civil rights became a central issue in the city's response to the crisis. The investigation finally gained traction when Anthony Harris, a member of the Nation of Islam splinter group, came forward as an informant. Harris provided crucial information about the killings and the organization behind them. He revealed that the murders were part of an initiation ritual for a group called the Death Angels. To earn their wings, members had to kill a certain number of devils, their term for white people. Harris's testimony painted a disturbing picture of the organization's ideology. The Death Angels believed they were participating in a holy war, and their victims were chosen solely based on their race. The group maintained detailed records of their kills, treating them as achievements to be celebrated. They even had a point system. Men were worth 3 points, women 2 points, and children 1 point. Through Harris's information, investigators identified 4 primary suspects: Jesse Lee Cooks, J.C. Simon, Larry Green, and Manuel Moore. All were members of the Nation of Islam and worked as security guards at Black Self-Help Moving and Storage, a business owned by the organization. The suspects' employment as security guards explained their access to weapons and their ability to move freely throughout the city without arousing suspicion. It also provided them with legitimate reasons to be in different neighborhoods at various times, making their movements harder to track. On May 1, 1974, police arrested the 4 main suspects. The arrests were conducted simultaneously to prevent any warning reaching the other suspects. During searches of their residences, police found evidence linking them to the murders, including weapons and personal items belonging to some of the victims. The scale of the organization's activities became clearer as the investigation progressed. While 14 murders were officially attributed to the Zebra killers, investigators believed the true number could be much higher. Some estimates suggested that Death Angels might have been responsible for as many as 73 murders across California. The subsequent trial was one of the longest and most expensive in California history at that time. It lasted 18 months and cost the state over $1 million. The prosecution presented 108 witnesses, including survivors of attacks and Anthony Harris, whose testimony was crucial to securing convictions. The defense attempted to discredit Harris, portraying him as an unreliable witness who had turned informant to save himself from prosecution. However, his testimony was corroborated by physical evidence and the accounts of surviving victims. The defense also tried to challenge the constitutionality of the police tactics used during the investigation, but these arguments ultimately failed to sway the jury. On March 9, 1976, all 4 defendants were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment. The convictions brought some closure to a terrified city, but the scars of the zebra murders would remain. The case had lasting effects on San Francisco. It exposed racial tensions that lay beneath the city's progressive surface and raised difficult questions about the balance between civil rights and public safety. The controversial stop-and-search policies implemented during the investigation would influence debates about police tactics and racial profiling for decades to come. The zebra murders also highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces when dealing with ideologically motivated killers. The Death Angels' religious justification for their crimes and their organizational structure made them particularly difficult to investigate using traditional methods. Their ability to operate undetected for so long demonstrated the limitations of conventional police work in the face of organized, motivated killers. The aftermath of the zebra murders left a complex legacy that would shape San Francisco's approach to law enforcement and race relations for years to come. The trial itself revealed disturbing details about the Death Angels organization that hadn't been previously made public. Court testimony showed that the group maintained a macabre scoring system, not just for murders, but also for acts of mutilation and torture. Members would receive special recognition for particularly brutal killings, which explained the escalating violence seen in many of the attacks. Anthony Harris's detailed testimony provided insight into the group's indoctrination process. New members were shown films and photographs of whites committing acts of violence against blacks throughout history, from slavery through the civil rights era. They were taught that their murders were acts of retribution and racial justice, not crimes. This psychological conditioning helped explain how otherwise ordinary men could commit such horrific acts without apparent remorse. The investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting that similar Death Angel cells might have operated in other California cities. Police in Los Angeles, Oakland, and Sacramento began reviewing unsolved murders from the same period that fit the zebra killer's pattern. While direct connections proved difficult to establish, investigators estimated that Death Angels members might have been responsible for up to 270 murders across California during the early 1970s. The convicted killers showed no remorse during their sentencing. J.C. Simon declared to the court that he was at war with the white race and saw his actions as justified. Manuel Moore maintained his innocence but stated that the murders were understandable given historical racial injustices. Their statements reinforced the ideological nature of their crimes and the challenges of preventing similar racially motivated violence in the future. The Nation of Islam publicly distanced itself from the Death Angels, claiming the group was a rogue operation that had perverted the organization's teachings. However, evidence presented at trial showed that some Nation of Islam leaders had been aware of the Death Angels' activities and had possibly provided support and protection to its members. The case had significant implications for law enforcement practices. The controversial stop-and-search tactics used during Operation Zebra led to new guidelines for police procedures during major investigations. While the emergency measures were eventually ruled constitutional, given the extraordinary circumstances, the case established important precedents about the limits of police power in crisis situations. The zebra murders also changed how San Francisco approached community policing. The case highlighted the importance of building trust between law enforcement and minority communities. The fact that Anthony Harris eventually came forward as an informant was credited to relationships some officers had maintained within the African American community despite the tensions created by Operation Zebra. For the survivors, the aftermath brought ongoing challenges. Richard Haig, who survived the initial attack that killed his wife Keita, struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. He became an advocate for victims' rights and spoke openly about the need to address racial violence without inflaming racial tensions. Arthur Agnos, who survived being shot 4 times, went on to become mayor of San Francisco from 1988 to 1992. his experience as a zebra victim influenced his approach to law enforcement and race relations during his administration. He worked to implement reforms that would balance public safety with civil rights protections. The case also had lasting effects on San Francisco's criminal justice system. The massive cost of the investigation and trial led to reforms in how major cases were funded and managed. The city established new protocols for handling complex long-term investigations and created specialized units to deal with hate crimes and ideologically motivated violence. Forensic practices were also influenced by the zebra case. The difficulty in linking various attacks and establishing patterns led to the development of new systems for tracking and analyzing violent crimes. These innovations would later prove valuable in identifying and investigating other serial killers and organized criminal groups. The 4 convicted killers, Jesse Lee Cooks, J.C. Simon, Larry Green, and Manuel Moore, were all sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Over the years, they filed numerous appeals, all of which were rejected. Their continued incarceration served as a reminder of one of San Francisco's darkest chapters. The lasting impact of the zebra murders extended far beyond the courtroom. In the decades following the convictions, researchers and law enforcement experts studied the case extensively, recognizing it as one of the first modern examples of ideologically motivated serial killings in America. The case became required study at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, as it represented a unique hybrid of organized crime, cult behavior, and serial murder. The Death Angels organizational structure proved particularly interesting to criminologists. Unlike typical serial killers who operate alone or in pairs, this was a hierarchical organization with clear rules, rituals, and a reward system. Their methods of recruiting and radicalizing members shared disturbing similarities with modern terrorist cells, making the case relevant to contemporary law enforcement challenges. Some of the surviving victims continued to speak out about their experiences. Roxanne McMillian, who was paralyzed in the attacks, became an outspoken advocate for victims' rights and racial reconciliation. From her wheelchair, she gave powerful testimonies about the importance of not letting violence breed more violence, and how her experience had strengthened her belief in the need for racial healing rather than division. The investigation's records revealed that the Death Angels maintained detailed documentation of their crimes, including photographs and personal items taken from victims. This evidence, sealed for decades due to its sensitive nature, showed the methodical way the group approached their murders. They kept careful count of their points and documented each killing with an almost bureaucratic attention to detail. The case also led to significant changes in how law enforcement handled informants. Anthony Harris's crucial testimony came at considerable personal risk. He had to be relocated and given a new identity after the trial. The extensive protection provided to Harris became a model for future witness protection programs, particularly in cases involving organized hate groups. Further investigation revealed that the Death Angels had a complex support network. Some members worked legitimate jobs in security or transportation, which provided cover for their activities. Others were involved in legal businesses that helped finance the group's operations. This integration into normal society made them particularly difficult to detect and highlighted the challenges of identifying extremist groups that operate behind legitimate facades. The group's use of religious ideology to justify murder was extensively studied by scholars of extremist movements. The Death Angels had created a twisted theology that combined elements of Nation of Islam teachings with their own violent philosophy. They used religious texts and historical examples of racial injustice to convince members that their actions were not only justified, but divinely mandated. In prison, the convicted killers followed different paths. Jesse Lee Cooks became a model prisoner and expressed remorse for his actions, participating in rehabilitation programs, and speaking to young inmates about the dangers of extremist ideology. J.C. Simon, however, maintained his radical beliefs and was repeatedly disciplined for attempting to spread his ideology to other inmates. The case files revealed that several other suspected members of the Death Angels were never charged due to lack of evidence. Some investigators believed these individuals may have been responsible for additional unsolved murders in other parts of California. However, without Anthony Harris's direct testimony linking them to specific crimes, prosecutors were unable to build cases against them. The zebra murders fundamentally changed how San Francisco approached hate crimes. The city established one of the first specialized hate crimes units in the country, recognizing that crimes motivated by racial or religious hatred required specific expertise and resources to investigate properly. This model would later be adopted by many other major cities. The case also led to innovations in criminal profiling. The unusual nature of the crimes, organized yet random, ideological yet personal, required new approaches to understanding criminal behavior. The FBI used the case to develop profiles of group-based serial killers, distinct from the lone wolf profile that dominated their understanding at the time. The investigation's documentation showed that the Death Angels had considered expanding their operations to other cities. Plans were found for similar cells in Los Angeles and Oakland, though these were apparently never fully implemented. This discovery led to increased cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions to monitor and prevent the formation of similar groups. The long-term psychological impact on San Francisco's residents was profound. The random nature of the killings had shattered the city's sense of security in a way that took years to rebuild. Community leaders worked to prevent the crimes from permanently damaging race relations, but the case left lasting scars on the city's psyche. The legacy of the zebra murders continued to evolve as new generations of San Franciscans learned about this dark chapter in their city's history. In the decades following the trial, historians and criminologists gained access to previously sealed documents that revealed even more disturbing details about the Death Angels' operations. Police records showed that the group had maintained detailed maps of San Francisco, marking potential target areas and escape routes. They had studied police patrol patterns and response times, demonstrating a level of planning that went far beyond random acts of violence. This methodical approach to murder made their crimes even more chilling in retrospect. The case files also revealed that the Death Angels had developed sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques. They rotated vehicles, changed their appearance regularly, and used legitimate business activities to establish alibis. These tactics helped explain why they had been able to operate undetected for so long, despite the massive police presence in the city. The psychological evaluations of the convicted killers, released years after their sentencing, provided disturbing insights into their mindset. Most showed no signs of traditional mental illness, supporting the theory that their violence was the result of ideological indoctrination rather than psychological dysfunction. This finding would later influence how law enforcement approached the investigation of ideologically motivated crimes. The role of Anthony Harris, the key informant, became the subject of numerous studies in law enforcement circles. His decision to come forward, despite the extreme risk to his life, was analyzed to better understand how to cultivate informants within closed, extremist groups. The protection protocols developed for Harris became a template for future witness protection programs dealing with organized hate groups. The investigation's files showed that the Death Angels had actually considered targeting other minority groups besides whites. Documents revealed plans to attack Asian Americans and Latinos, viewing them as collaborators with the white power structure. These plans were never carried out, but they demonstrated the group's potential to expand their campaign of terror even further. Follow-up investigations in the 1980s and 1990s revealed that some suspected members of the Death Angels had moved to other states after the arrests in San Francisco. While they were never directly linked to violent crimes in these locations, their presence raised concerns about the potential spread of their ideology. The case's influence on law enforcement practices continued to evolve. The specialized techniques developed to investigate the zebra murders were adapted and refined for use in tracking other forms of organized extremist violence. The lesson that ideologically motivated killers required different investigative approaches than traditional criminals became a fundamental principle in law enforcement training. The surviving victims and their families continued to grapple with the aftermath of the crimes. Many reported that the racial nature of the attacks had fundamentally changed their worldview. Some, like Richard Haig, chose to channel their trauma into positive action, working with anti-violence programs and promoting racial reconciliation. The case also had lasting effects on how the media covered racially motivated crimes. The careful balance required to report on the zebra murders without inflaming racial tensions established important precedents for responsible journalism in cases involving hate crimes. As San Francisco continued to change and evolve, the zebra murders remained a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremist ideology and the importance of maintaining vigilance against organized hate groups. The case served as a reminder that even the most progressive cities are not immune to racial violence, and that the work of building and maintaining racial harmony requires constant effort. The Death Angels' targeting of random victims based solely on race became a model for understanding how hate groups can dehumanize entire categories of people. This understanding would prove valuable in later decades as law enforcement faced new challenges from other forms of ideologically motivated violence. Today, the zebra murders stand as one of the most significant criminal cases in San Francisco's history, not only for their brutality, but for their lasting impact on law enforcement, race relations, and the city's approach to preventing and responding to hate crimes. The lessons learned from this dark chapter continue to influence how we understand and combat ideologically motivated violence in the modern era.